Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, scientists, educators, social scientists, government leaders, politicians. All will be one to one. I'm delighted to welcome the writer and teacher, Honor Moore, to the program. Her latest book, The Bishop's Daughter, a memoir, couldn't be more personal and revelatory. She was a child of spiritual and material privilege. Her father, the revered Bishop of St. John the Divine, but her parents, devoted to helping others, kept huge secrets from their large family. And the book, published by W. Norton, tells us the difficulties it posed for them and their oldest daughter, Honor. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Your father, who I remember well, was an almost mythical figure for New Yorkers. His social activism, his movie star good looks, his regal bearing. When did you realize he was more than just Dad?
Oh, well, it was more when I realized he was more than just this figure in vestments. You know, it was complicated to have a father who swept down the street in vestments and who preached from the pulpit.
So he's always bigger than life.
Always, and he was 6'5".
Right, right.
So, you know, it was complicated. But the way he was Dad was to tell stories. Sometimes made up, sometimes reading us stories. I think when my relationship with him got more complicated and when I saw him as a more complicated person was when my mother died in 1973, leaving 9 children, the oldest of whom, me, was 27 and the youngest 11. That was a hard time.
Why did you write the book?
I wrote the book. A friend of mine once said, "Well, why anything?" I wrote the book because I'm a writer, and because I had this father who was very complicated. We had a very complicated relationship, particularly after my mother died. It just became very hard between us, and I felt sad and guilty, really, for much of my adult life about my relationship with him. And luckily, we reconciled. We sort of came to some resolution as he was dying and when he died. And then I knew, and my love for him returned. All my childhood sort of adoration and love and sense of him as my father returned. And then I thought, oh, this is a story. I could never have written a book that was sort of angry and embittered, but I could tell a love story. I could tell a story about a relationship that goes from childhood love, goes through a lot of complexity, and returns to love. And so I would say that on the deepest level, I wanted my father back, and I wanted to chart our relationship in terms of this returned love,
right,
and also integrating into the whole story his very difficult and our very difficult family secrets.
Both of your parents came from backgrounds that were privileged in a Gilded Age sort of way.
Right.
I mean, tremendous wealth and ancestry and, you know, nannies and private schools and horses and fox hunting and estates and apartments on Fifth Avenue. Yet, as a child, you shuttled back and forth between working class neighborhoods where there were poor people and people of color, and the great luxury of the country states and the Fifth Avenue apartments. What was that like?
Well, for a long time I thought that if you got to be old, you got to have a big, fabulous, beautiful house in the country.
Look, that were true. I'm waiting.
And then I realized, of course, that wasn't true. So it was a contradiction. It was difficult. I mean, on the one hand, it was wonderful to go to my grandmother's gentleman's farm and, you know, stay in this beautiful big house and ride horses and be in the country. And on the other hand, it was a little confusing because home was Jersey City and walking to school and people who had a lot less than we did, and and people of color, and the beginnings of the civil rights movement, a recognition of injustice, recognition of what, of course, was then called prejudice.
But I gather that your period at Christ Church in Jersey City was perhaps the most interesting part of your childhood.
Grace Church.
Grace Church.
No, it was Christ Church in Indianapolis.
Okay.
I always said to my father that it was, he said it was, and I said yes, because there were all these kids. I mean, I guess there were 6 or 7 of us when we left Jersey City. And I was the oldest, and so I got increasingly far from my mother's lap. And there were plenty of extra adults. You know, there were the 2 other priests besides my father. There were the people who came to work, you know, just sort of out of college students and so on, who came to work at the parish and do the baseball teams in the summer and so on. And there were just always people staying with us.
Right.
So it was...
And sort of an open rectory.
An open rectory,
right.
And it was just fun, because there was always someone to talk to,
right.
And it was also exciting. You know, there were always a lot of people at dinner, and very interesting conversations. And
what was the contrast between life in Jersey City and life in Indiana at Christ Church?
The contrast was huge. For one thing, there were no extra people at dinner. For another thing, we went to a school that was almost completely white, and that was very strange. And it was very clear almost immediately that there was, you know, that there was something very dark and brutal going on in terms of race relations there. And I guess you could say we, you know, that it was more the real world, as you know, America was in the 1950s. But it was a culture shock, I would say.
Your parents both seemed to be wonderful in many ways, and yet you were on numerous occasions estranged from both of them. What do you think that was about?
I think that as the oldest, I was close to both of them, and also very sensitive when there started to be complexities and difficulties in their relationship. And I also think it was the inevitable consequence of growing up, you know, rebellion.
Right.
And I think that both, for some reason, both the form the rebellion took or the alienation took from both of them was very intense. You know, my mother had a temper, I had a temper. You know, my parents, somehow I felt that as the divisions between them began to happen when I was in my 20s, I began to feel I had to take sides, and I didn't want to take sides. I don't know that it was something specific to us as much as it was the kind of inevitable fallout of a marriage that was coming apart.
Right.
And
an adolescent daughter's reaction to it all.
Headstrong adolescent daughter.
The big secret of your parents' lives, and you know, the secret that you reveal in your book, was that your father, despite being a married, much celebrated Episcopal priest, had numerous sexual affairs with both men and women in the course of his life. Can you describe when you learned that your father was gay?
I learned, and my entire family learned, that my father was bisexual. He described himself in 1990 through a series of accidents. It's a little, my father's extramarital relationships with women happened really between marriages. It happened when he and my mother had agreed both to see other people. But he did have a hidden homosexual life for most of his life. And it was a source of pain and conflict for him.
So why do you think he married twice and had 9 children by your mother? Was he just unable to come out as a gay man or bisexual in the 50s and 60s? And
Well, he certainly was unable to come out as a gay man in the 50s and 60s, but I think there's something more interesting and complicated. He would always describe human sexuality as a spectrum, with homosexuality over here and heterosexuality over here, and most of us are in between. That was one of his descriptions of sexuality. I think that it simply was so clearly not a choice that he could have made when he was young, that his homosexuality became compartmentalized. And he always described himself, and I believe him, as having fallen in love with my mother and then having fallen in love with my stepmother. So I think he's an example of human complexity, you know. And I think it was a source of torment, and I think it was a challenge to his faith, and I think it was also something, the conflict within him gave him great compassion for other people. And was
Your mother was a very interesting person as well. How did your father's double life, well, you talk a little about her and also about how your father's inner conflicts affected her?
Well, I can only imagine how they affected her, because she died in 1973. She was very much a part, she was a team member in the ministry that my father was in Jersey City, a full team member.
Right.
She had 9 children. She published a book, a memoir, about our lives in Jersey City called The People on 2nd Street in 1968. And then she died of cancer in 1973. And I really only found out subsequent to not until 1990, what the real pain in their marriage had been, and in fact that she had found out and never confronted my father.
Right. But you knew there was something.
Well, I knew there was, that the marriage was was falling apart. I mean, she did tell me that. She said, I'm no longer happy in my marriage. And I was, at the time, which was when I was in my late 20s, furious. My marriage? I thought it was our marriage. I thought it was our family, And
you were furious at her?
I was furious at her.
Okay.
And I didn't know until almost 20 years later that it was a much more complicated story, and that she was not, she was not crazy, and she was not at fault, and that it was great difficulty. Now, I came to have enormous compassion for her and enormous compassion for them both, because I think marriage is complicated. I think sexuality is complicated, and I think people do the best they can.
We have to take a break. We'll be back with more after the following message.
Oh, those boys are much too much. Those boys are much too much. We got the spirit. We're hot. We can't be stopped. We got the spirit. We're hot. We can't be stopped. We're going to beat them and bust them. Beat them.
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life.
Let's get a little bit rowdy. R-O-W-D-Y.
Take time to be a
One
dad
more
today.
time. Oh, those boys are much too much. Those boys.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Honor Moore, author of The Bishop's Daughter, a memoir. It's just been published by W.W. Norton and Company. Your father went from being this amazingly privileged white guy who was both racist and anti-Semitic, you wrote, to being totally politically involved in civil rights, in women's rights, in the concerns of the poor, in ordaining an openly lesbian woman as a priest. What were his thoughts about the connection between religion and politics?
Well, my father was a very emotional man, and the most beautiful statement of he had a conversion experience to the church, at 17. He had another conversion experience during the war to a kind of consciousness of death. And then he had still another conversion experience when he began to work with poor people, both in downtown New York and in Jersey City right after the war. And he described it as, you know, you look into the, you have a kid on a baseball team. You look into his face and you see that he's a little, looks like he might be hungry. You go visit the family. You find out that they live in substandard housing. You try and get them public housing. You're turned away because the public housing is racist. Then you end up in the mayor's office, and then you end up in Washington. And for him, it was all connected. It was all connected to that connection to another
and ministering
human,
and pastoring to people.
pastoring.
Yeah.
And his prejudices were simply lifted once he began to know people who were different than himself as people.
We now, you know, there've been a lot of, you know, your father sort of became well known because of his inner city ministry,
Right.
and because of, you know, the activism, bringing the church into the problems, engaging the church in the problems of people's lives. You know, there've been a lot of clergymen over time who have meshed politics with religion. I mean, from Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell to Reverend Jeremiah Wright, unfortunately, and Al Sharpton. What do you think your father would have thought of these guys?
Well, what would he have thought of these guys? Well, you know, he took guys one at a time. You know,
Yeah.
he had great admiration, obviously, for Martin Luther King, but he once said, "Well, I never knew him well."
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think he would have, you know, he would have sized these. He would have said, "Well, Al Sharpton is great on the issues, and maybe sometimes I disagree with him," and he would have. You know, he would have taken them one at a time, I think. And he would, I know that he was very upset. He organized a conference in the 80s, I believe, maybe it was even the early 90s, about the left and religion, because he felt that the right was hijacking religion,
And they have.
and they have.
They've run off with it.
And he wanted to sort of bring back the notion of progressive politics and religion, and that is a very when I was writing the book and writing the part about the '60s and the civil rights movement, it is so striking, you know, how religious people were involved and central to the civil rights movement, and how now religious people
Are so conservative.
Are
you
so
know.
conservative.
Did you ever think your father was a hypocrite?
I did think my father was a hypocrite at various times, basically around the women's issue, briefly. I did. I was furious when he criticized the Episcopal women priests who had a maverick ordination in 1974. He said, we wait and do it through the church. We were working on changing the church. I said, it's been 2,000 years, Pop.
Right.
You know, you're out on the barricades for other things. Why won't you be out on the barricades for women? So it was about.
What was that about? Just sort of some old-fashioned notions?
It was about, he really liked to work within the system. He liked to. His idea was to change things from within, and then usually what happened was he'd be pushed to the limitation of that, and he would take to the barricades.
Right.
You know, but of course he was old-fashioned. He was born in 1919,
Right.
and he was courtly. And
Right. What do you most want to say about your mother?
what do I once? My mother was an extraordinary, powerful and brilliant woman who died way too early. She died at 50.
How old was she?
She was 50. She had published her first book, and I remember when she became diagnosed, she said everything was just starting.
Yeah.
Personally, what I want to say was that she and I had been at this, you know, we'd been in this battle most of our lives together, on and off, and at the end of her life, she wrote me an extraordinary series of letters, basically apologizing for her part in our difficulties. And we had started to become friends, and I regret that we didn't
have more time.
Didn't have more time, yeah.
In your own personal life, you have also vacillated between men and women. Do you think that has anything to do with the confused vibe you were getting from your father?
Possibly. It certainly did. I mean, if you have a father who is not heterosexual, or who is conflicted about his heterosexuality, it
comes through in some way.
It's going to come through in some way. I wouldn't describe it as, I was with men until I was 30, and then I was with women for 15, 17 years, and then I returned to men. So and I did think it was interesting when I began to return to men that it was after I had learned of my father's homosexuality. Yes, the confused vibe, but what I remember, but also a moment in history, as the women's movement, there was a great openness to women being together sexually and in romantic and marital relationships. So I think that was part of it, but I also remember just having this great confusion about my father and thinking, I'll deal with that later, And
what was it like after your father died, meeting and talking to his longtime gay lover, Andrew?
It was wonderful. It was wonderful. I talked to him on the phone first, and he had the most wonderful, kind and kind of wacky laugh. And I was just very moved that, and he is a very open person. And I was amazed at what my father had shared with him. And I was happy for my father that there was at least one person in his life with whom he could be his whole and complicated.
And that lasted, 25 years? It was a long time.
It was a long time. I mean, it was on and off and in and out.
And it was so interesting that also after your father died, he decided to get married, right?
Yes. Life is so weird.
The Moors were a wacky bunch.
A wacky bunch, a passionate bunch.
Right, a passionate bunch. Towards the end of his life, you and your father became close again. What was that like?
Well, he was diagnosed as basically terminally ill around New Year's Day of 2003. And so we started dealing with that. And as he got sicker, I felt this. It was as if something inside me was thawing out or falling away or coming back to life. I felt my childhood love return, which I had forgotten I had had.
Right.
And it was.
And it certainly comes across in the book.
And it was a gift. I just thought. At first, I resisted it. I thought, and then I just thought, this is a gift. And I started thinking, oh, he's so tall, and look at those funny ears, the way they stick out. It was partly physical. It was partly I wanted to. I started seeing him as a man again, instead of as this force that I didn't understand and who made me angry at times and who I was afraid of, etc.
Did you come away from writing the book feeling differently about your parents?
I did, actually. I felt a great deal of compassion for my mother and a great admiration for her intelligence and intellect, and my father the same.
And compassion, I would.
Absolutely compassion. But these two people, they were so young when they started doing all these
this mission,
this great idealistic mission that they stuck to, and they both stuck to their guns. And
are there lessons for all of us in learning about in discovering our parents after their deaths?
I think so. I think that, at least for me, discovering the truth about my parents and being able to talk about it made me able to really discover more about my own self and wholeness. I think human beings want to be whole, and I think secrets keep us partial, and that when we can know the truth with love, then we can be whole, or more whole.
So it sets you free.
Yeah.
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 I'm sorry, but we're out of time. But I want to thank Anna Moore for joining me. The Bishop's Daughter, a memoir, has just been published by W.W. Norton and Company. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.